What's up, Las Vegas? Wow, what is there, 35,000 people at this conference? I think maybe 35 of you here, so I do appreciate you guys coming out. Tons of suits here. Vice President J.D. Vance was here. Politicians are here. So what does that all mean? Why are we all in the most pure fiat city in the world? So the title of this panel is Bretton Woods 2.0. So maybe what is Bretton Woods? Roger, do you want to maybe tackle that?
Yeah, I'll try to keep it a little bit short because we're not here necessarily for the Bretton Woods part. But the short of it is that Bretton Woods was an agreement in the U.S. dollar system to rectify balance of payments, which is basically countries paying one another. And there's two organizations that are really important to that: the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. Since 1976, actually, the Bretton Woods system no longer exists. It's part of the greater, what the fuck happened in 1971 part. Essentially, the IMF and the World Bank were tasked initially with fixing the rates of exchange with gold and everything else, but obviously the United States went another way with that. And now these days it's about development loans, political choices, and supporting dictators. But we'll get into that a little bit more throughout the panel.
Efrat, why was the Bretton Woods so important, and what did happen in 1971?
Right. So I think it's in July, in a couple of months, that Bretton Woods is celebrating 81 years. This is right at the end of the fourth turning. And Bretton Woods took part in New Hampshire. New Hampshire is the first state that have now signed a Bitcoin Strategic Reserve Act. And I don't think that there are coincidences in life. I think what we are seeing right now is the next Bretton Woods, the Bretton Woods 2.0. The fact that it's starting in New Hampshire is really symbolic, but the fact that back then Bretton Woods was supposed to be the solution and a new world order after the world wars that the world experienced. And these days, what are we experiencing again? Wars, turbulence, crises. We're at that end of the fourth turning, so we are looking at creating a new world order again, and to be more precise, a new monetary system that is really the oxygen of how the world works. And so we're at that beginning of that process. I don't know if the beginning, maybe the middle. I think by the end of the decade, we're going to see a new monetary order in place. The next few years are going to be critical. We're going to talk about that more in the panel.
Sure. Ben, what happened in 1971?
So in 1971, we had the golden window broken. So if for 27 years the US dollar was convertible to gold, from that moment onwards is no longer. And essentially we are in a fiat system. Fiat system means that the king or the government dictates by law that we have to use this as money. Now, what happened since is that over time we lost trust in the money. And that brought on the 70s inflation. So in the 1970s, we had severe inflation, which led to a lot of currency collapses in the 80s, a new monetary agreement in the 80s, in the end of the 80s. And ever since then, we've been witnessing the decline of the dollar in terms of how other countries around the world respect it. So when the US was a good partner, they believed that the U.S. can supply them with security, with trade partnerships, and all of that. But in the last 4 decades, we've seen the rise of China. We've seen Russia become a trade partner. We've seen the rise of the Middle East and the convertibility between oil and dollar. And countries now want to have more influence on their own sectors, on their own geopolitical hemisphere. And that's the stage we're on right now.
Well, yeah, that's definitely fascinating. So let's talk about the last decade then in de-dollarization. I mean, why are countries looking to get off the dollar?
Well, the dollar is continuing to be the world reserve currency, but countries are experiencing sanctions from the U.S., for example. They have no choice but to start looking for alternatives. And so they're starting to make themselves stronger by using other currencies or using sometimes cryptocurrencies we're seeing lately, or going back to gold, hoarding on more and more gold in central banks around the world. I think that reality is going to continue. The de-dollarization trend is going to continue. My friends here are more knowledgeable than me on that point. I just want to add one more thing to the previous question. We just saw Lynn Alden talking about the fact that you cannot stop this train, that we've reached the point where the debt crisis is just growing and growing, and there are no brakes for the train, and you cannot stop it. And what we are experiencing right now is basically the Gresham's law on a global scale. So we're seeing the world slowly understanding that that train has no brakes, and they have to move on to better money, to sound money. And that is the process that we're in.
Okay, so
I'd like to add for that, because eventually when we look at the trend of de-dollarization, we cannot look at it in a vacuum. The U.S., by issuing the reserve currency, it has disadvantages and it has advantages. The disadvantages, it means that you need to export your base. So your industry has moved on to cheaper places by sending dollars into the world that needs it. But the advantages that the U.S. had was that they were able to impose sanctions. For example, if a country like Russia, if we jump to 2022, uses its military power to invade a different country, and the U.S. and Europe dictates that that was unlawful, suddenly the U.S. with an agreement can essentially sanction 300 billion of Russian money. But that was just the end of it. Until then, we had a lot of billions of dollars sanctioned by the United States, and not just for war activity, but also for cultural things like LGBTQ or ESG. Are you pro-climate? Are you against climate? If you don't do what we say, we will not give you access to dollars, and countries had enough of it, and that's why they want to take control of their own currency.
I'll just speak really specifically about China for a little bit. China is a credible economic alternative for many countries around the world now. They have built out their own alternative Bretton Woods system with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, along with drawing special privileges in the IMF allocations, the special drawing rights. The thing with China is that I think China somewhere down the line realized investing in U.S. treasuries with all the U.S. dollars they were getting was a significantly bad idea, probably somewhat earlier than other countries are getting the notice. And I think because of that, the current Chinese party state has really made themselves resilient to U.S. dollar diplomacy and to U.S. dollar force. And we can't forget that Bretton Woods actually started as a drive for peace. It ended quite disastrously. But the United States once was able to stop wars without firing a single bullet. Efrat's talking about the great churning. In the Suez Canal crisis, where Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, the IMF gave loans to all four combatants in that war, Israel, France, Britain, and Egypt, and told the United Kingdom that they would sanction the pound sterling if the United Kingdom did not obey its directives. That was the end of the British Empire, and it didn't happen because of any bullets. It happened because the United States was able to impose its monetary will on other countries. Unfortunately, because of misappropriate policy decisions, because of fiat cycles that have run, the United States no longer has that capability.
I think that's clear from all these examples here, how the fiat monetary system is a weapon, right? It's being weaponized for wars, for political interests again and again and again. That was the reality until now.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, as the most dominant superpower in the world, the United States is not just going to let the world de-dollarize easily. An astonishing fact is it cost about 7 cents to make a $100 bill. So they don't want to kind of compete on that front. So what is the United States trying to do now to combat de-dollarization and to lead to a Bretton Woods 2.0? Because maybe they don't want that.
Yeah. So I think it's very good to put it in the right perspective to begin with. So when we look at the Bretton Woods system or the reserve currency, we look at several factors that mean the most. One of them is how much in dollar reserves is being held by other countries. So, for example, today it's estimated that about 45% of the global reserves is held in US dollar denominated facilities, products or debt. And when it comes to payments, eventually when you receive a payment, you have to invoice it in something. That something is 70% of the time US dollar. And it's important to put it in that perspective when we try and understand how much power the US still has to fight against the de-dollarization trend, because it does have that power. It has that power because it has the largest consumer base and the richest consumer base in the world. So if you want to partner with China, China is an exporter. They just want to sell you. They barely want to buy from you. The US wants to buy from you. So they impose tariffs. You want to sell to us? Pay higher prices, pay taxes that bring in more beneficial things for our people. Another thing they can do is increase their sanctions. So, for example, you have two types of sanctions. One is fiscal, that the US Treasury can enforce and say, you are a terrorist country and I don't want to send dollars to you, or within the central bank level. So the central banks, they operate what's called liquidity swaps. They allow other central banks and other financial institutions in the world to access cheap US dollar directly within the central bank. But if now the US wants to still enforce dominance of the dollar, they can say, you're not getting this liquidity. You want dollars? Pay higher. And other things, I'm sure my fellow panelists can expand on stable coins and more.
Well, before we get to stablecoins, I do want to talk a little bit about the Trump regime.
But we've got more on this.
Okay.
You want to take something?
Stablecoins? You go first.
No, but
it's related.
So there's one thing before stablecoins, which is all the recent calls that we're hearing from people like Scott Bessent recently saying that we have to change the monetary system, that we have to reform the organizations of the Bretton Woods agreements, like the World Bank and the IMF. We hear the French President Macron coming out recently, a couple of years ago, saying we need a financial shock to fight global warming. They find different excuses for it. You hear the President of Brazil at the time, Lula da Silva, saying that we need to reform the World Bank and IMF because they're not functioning anymore according to what they are supposed to. So the roles have to change. So you hear a lot of political figures and decision makers calling for a change in the monetary system. They're saying it. It's not a conspiracy theory. The question is, how is it going to look like? What would this reform look like? And they have a lot of power. The other thing is stablecoins, and I'll just say one word about that. So the stablecoins are admittedly now by the new AI and crypto czar and by the administration here in the US do play a very important role in continuing to extend the globalization of the US dollar around the world. That is a very important role of the stablecoin. And by them saying that, we have to read between the lines or behind the scenes and understand the meaning of it. Speaking as a marketeer, when you take a product and you go directly to customer, you used to be a B2B, business to business, right? You sold as a government to another government, or G2G. Now, what is the government doing? It's selling its product, the US dollar, directly to a consumer in a foreign country, bypassing the banking system, the government. That is a lot of power in the hands of the US when it creates that direct relationship with citizens all around the world. And that creates an indirect demand, once again, to the US dollar from foreign countries. They do want to hold the US dollar. They have to, because they're suffering from the currency fiat system. And their way of doing it is through stablecoins. So the stablecoin is here acting as a bridge to the US dollar and to the fiat financial system of another country. And that's a very important power that the US is holding.
I kind of just want to paint a really simple heroes and villains narrative right now as we're kind of anchoring into this topic. Fun fact, the two most corrupt governments in the world as measured by the Guinness World Record book, Suharto and Imelda Marcos, shout out to the current leader of the Philippines, who is their son, funded by IMF loans. And now you have China, who is trying to create an alternative version of this architecture. I don't even know where that will lead because the Chinese Communist Party is just rancidly corrupt on so many levels. Those are the two actors that are fighting for positive control over this infrastructure. As Bitcoiners, and I have to say this really loud for everyone to hear, as Bitcoiners out here, I consider myself a Bitcoiner, there is a need for a positive vision that goes beyond this game of geopolitical giving to leaders, corrupt dictators, and others. There is an opportunity for liberty and freedom if we are proactive about thinking through this architecture. And it behooves us because, no offense, Tether is not Bitcoin, and Tether and stablecoins are not going to figure this out for us. And the U.S. government, while it may try to maintain its power through stablecoins, I think we'll eventually have to face the music of that down the line. And it is in our hands and the hands of these people at the stage that that fight's going to be waged.
I want to add two more things to what the U.S. can do. Absolutely. So there are two more things. One is, both of them are very obvious, especially to all of us sitting here. One is strategic deals, right? So the Trump administration is jumping all around the world and creating new trade deals with Saudi Arabia, with Qatar, with the UK, bending the EU now in order to obtain this dominance. So that's one aspect. And the other, which was less discussed but is very obvious to all of us, is Bitcoin. So the US government, we had the vice president standing here, at the conference and speaking about how they see the importance of Bitcoin as a strategic asset for the US government. Now, there is something that is less discussed, and that's the battle between Bitcoin and gold as the reserve currency. The BRICS countries, the de-dollarization countries, they are all acquiring gold in record numbers, and they try and make gold the alternative, including creating payment systems and settlement systems that behind the scenes rely mostly on gold. Now, what the US is doing is essentially saying, hold on, we can create a new system around the new digital gold that's more liquid globally, that can be that has limited supply as opposed to gold, with new foundings in Uganda just last week. And by using Bitcoin, by adopting Bitcoin as a strategic reserve, we essentially expand the US Treasury balance sheet, potentially even in a faster way than the US debt. And that's actually possible, which is what's behind the Cynthia Loomis Bitcoin bill, that she wants to buy 1 million Bitcoin coins in the next 5 years and hold them for 15 years so that the Bitcoin standard is enacted by the United States and allows maintaining the US dollar dominance. And that's the biggest tool that the US government has in their playbook.
I must add another thing. Please, one short one. We all remember in 1971 the petrodollar agreements, right? So the US dollar is going to be the currency that the world is using to trade and settle deals of oil, right? Oil and gas. And what is the most scarce and demanded asset today? And more people will figure it out into the future. It's Bitcoin, right? So shout out to Mark Goodwin and the great work he's been doing on the Bitcoin dollar theory. If petrodollar was the system for the past 50-something years where we had to trade and settle deals to get the most needed asset in the world, oil, maybe now Bitcoin will start being the next asset that countries are fighting over. We know that there is scarce demand. We know that the U.S. is heavily dollarizing Bitcoin through stable coins. I mean, you have to zoom out and look at this process from afar and see the play that is being played here, right? But if Bitcoin is the end game, then Bitcoin is going to be a very important asset going forward. And maybe there is just like the petrodollar, there's going to be a Bitcoin dollar system.
Is a Bitcoin dollar system good for Bitcoiners?
Well, don't they say everything's good for Bitcoin? Bitcoin doesn't care, right? It is what it is. Question is it good for individuals? Is it good for us as holders of Bitcoin? And, I'll let you guys...
Yeah, so I'll loop into that. So basically, when we talk about the Bitcoin dollar system and whether if it's good for Bitcoin, I think there's one key aspect we need to take into account, and that's self-custody, it's true freedom, it's understanding the mechanism of Bitcoin in order to maintain its control. So while we talk about stablecoins are essentially a private sector extension of a potential CBDC, right? A central bank digital currency. Now, we see the central bank as this centralized authority managing money, creating the price of money as if it's possible for one institution to understand and the whole market and say, yeah, this will be the price of money. And when we look at CBDCs and stablecoins, we have to remember that it's the government behind it. The government can impose regulation, the government can do many other things in order to prevent self-custody and the true freedom of receiving Bitcoin, sending Bitcoin, and holding Bitcoin. And we have to remember Executive Order 6102 from 1934, where FDR, Roosevelt, essentially took the gold from the people in order to steal it from them and devalue gold against the dollar. And by holding Bitcoin with us, we can make the Bitcoin dollar system very good for us. If we hold it with custodians, that's a bad thing, and we need to take it into account.
So when I took a look at this panel topic, I was like, that's wild. Are they going to ask me to reimagine the world's financial architecture in like 30 minutes? I guess so. So I started thinking about 3 non-obvious implications of that. Had to focus my thinking a little bit. So the first is that actually what's happening now, which Bitcoin does actually directly solve, is that the World Bank and the IMF have gotten it into their heads that their mandate is to solve climate change by basically not allowing developing nations to develop their energy resources. And I actually think the countries that are realizing that this is, again, another form of imperialism, the Bhutans of the world, are realizing they can just use their stranded energy and monetize it. They no longer have to play the game of getting the US dollar in order to develop their own resources. We live in a world where the poorest nations on earth are energy exporters. It still doesn't make any sense to me, actually. The second non-obvious implication is that I really believe that embracing Bitcoin is going to be transparency for the powerful, but privacy for the weak. In the same way that we were talking about individuals being able to benefit from a Bitcoin dollar system outside of the constraints, we live in a world, we just talked about how the IMF just gives money purportedly with all these strings. If you looked at Imelda Marcos's shoe collection, it was $800 million, some crazy amount. So these loans that are going out, where's the transparency? Where are the funds going? And I think Bitcoin is this very unique system where you can actually hold the powerful to their feet while giving those people who don't have access to as many funds, the liberty and freedom to make their own choices and to make private transactions if they so choose, or semi-private. And then the last implication I was thinking about was when Bretton Woods architected, it really was, I encourage every one of you all to read your enemies, and one of my enemies is Keynes. Keynes is one of the architects of the Bretton Woods system. There's a great book about him, though. It's called The Price of Peace. And I think the reason, the one thing I'm just going to bring up here is that all these things we talk about, very abstract, and they can seem kind of like a little floaty. It does matter, because like I mentioned to you before, the United States once had the ability to stop wars with money and no longer does. What does that mean for a world where governments are being asked to do more health spending, more defense spending, to commit to 2% of GDP to NATO? These are the questions we have to ask ourselves, and this is why I believe embracing Bitcoin in a meaningful way can actually erode the capacity of states to commit war against one another. But we don't have enough time for me to go all over that. So if you guys have final words.
Yeah, I just want to, my final thought more about CBDCs and how they play into this picture of the new monetary system. So this is everything we're seeing now, all those floating pieces of the puzzle that are going to come together at one point are all part of what's called the digital transformation of the financial system. If you look at the tech industry, almost every industry around the world have been digitized in the last 10, 20 years, depending on the industry. The financial system is probably the last one to go through that process. And in implementing that process, every country is going to take a different shape and form. Some of them will implement CBDCs. Some of them will go the stablecoin route to lead them later into a Bitcoin route. Some of them will do tokenized assets and deposits. They will try every type of financial instrument under the sun, and we are going to be the guinea pigs that it's tried on. This is a transitory phase where a lot of these new financial digital products are being tried, in my opinion, in the end of the day, to get to the conclusion that Bitcoin is the winner and it's the sound money that we all need, and all roads will lead to Rome.
I will leave you all with a final thought as well, and that's Bretton Woods is a concept. It's the peace agreement of a money war. So there was a 30-year money war until we arrived at 1944 inside Bretton Woods. We are now in the midst of the war. And in this war, every card is on the table, every action is possible, including what's written in the Bitcoin Reserve Act, which is selling gold in order to buy Bitcoin. Because if BRICS companies are buying gold in record amounts, go check me out. In the last 7 years, they've bought more than they bought in the 1970s combined, right? If the U.S. now decides not only to reevaluate the gold on the balance sheet to market price, but to even to take it to $6,000 or $10,000 per 1 ounce of gold, only to sell it in order to buy Bitcoin, it crushes their monetary regimes while bringing in the Bitcoin dollar regime much more strongly, and that's something we should all be looking at.
I'll leave you all with a parting thought. Bitcoin good, CBDC bad. Woo!
Yes, exactly.
Thank you, guys. I've enjoyed this panel immensely. I want to thank Roger Wang from Bitcoin Magazine, author of What Would Mao Buy Bitcoin, Efrat from You're the Voice podcast, and Ben Smoka, the leading Bitcoin influencer in Israel and the founder of CryptoJungle. Thank you, guys.
Thank you,
Form your
Cedric.
own Bretton Woods agreement. Hold your own keys. Get your sats to 2030. Make it
Thank
through
you,
the fourth
Cedric.
turning for you and your family.
And thank you, Cedric.
Cedric.